This is capital S. This is small s. In this video we will learn words which begins with letter S.
S for saucer. S for shoe. S for shoulder. S for six. S for slate. S for sugar. S for sweets. S for sandal. S for sun. S for star. S for squirrel. S for spoon. S for sack. S for sad. S for same. S for sandwich. S for sapling. S for scene. S for scratch. S for stitching. S for shaving. S for shooting. S for shrubs. S for shut. S for shy. S for singing. S for siren. S for skating. S for slice. S for slow. S for snow. S for spanner. S for spitting. S for stamp. S for stem. S for steps. S for sandalwood. S for sweater. S for syrup. S for sword. S for sugarcane. S for stick. S for steel. S for stand. S for stall. S for stable. S for soup. S for song. S for soldier. S for soft. S for soda. S for sneeze. S for snail. S for smoke. S for smash. S for slip. S for sleeves. S for slap. S for sky. S for skirt. S for skill. S for sit. S for sip. S for sink. S for SIM card. S for silver. S for silicon. S for signature. S for sieve. S for ship. S for shield. S for ships. S for shadow. S for sesame. S for seat. S for shell. S for seal. S for seagull. S for sea. S for seabird. S for scrub. S for scream. S for scooter. S for scoop. S for scissor. S for school. S for scent. S for scale. S for saw. S for sauces. S for satin. S for sapphire. S for sand. S for salt. S for salon. S for salmon. S for saliva. S for sail. S for salad. S for scent. S for sailboats. S for sage. S for saffron. S for saddle. S for spear. S for scanner. S for shirt. S for scrap. S for scorpion. S for scarf. S for scalp. S for celery. S for sickle. S for saltries. S for sari. S for signal. S for silkworm. S for single. S for suitcase. S for sunset. S for sunrise. S for singer fort. S for sorry. S for sachet. S for sunflower. S for shorts. S for shopkeeper. S for shop. S for sheep.